What's up guys, and welcome to my how to build a PC tutorial guide for 2025. I have to start out by saying it's actually not the best time to build a computer right now because GPUs are in shortage. So the system that I am going to be building should cost around $1,200 to $1,300 US, but you might need to give it a little bit of time for GPU prices to come down. The rest of the parts are currently available. The core system is around $650, add $600 for a 9070 XT, or even $550 for a 9070 will get you a really nice high-performing system, and I really hope the prices come down so that becomes a reality soon.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by Thermaltake's TR100 mini tower case and travel trunk. The TR100 is a diminutive but full-featured dual-chamber chassis with a surprisingly roomy interior for high-end PC builds, available in a variety of colors with support for up to 360mm GPUs and a 280mm AIO radiator on top. The modular design means side panels are all removable for cable management, and upgrades include an optional LCD panel or the travel trunk to easily take your TR100 gaming PC setup on the go. For more on the TR100 mini tower case from Thermaltake, check out my build or click the sponsor link in the video description. The first step to building a new computer is choosing the parts that you will build with, and I have lots of videos on that, so I highly recommend checking out my monthly build series, which is called Build Fix. Or if you check out my 3-part tutorial from a couple years back, I have a full guide on all the individual parts and what they are and what they do. Please note that we are building just the core PC today for around, again, $1,200 to $1,300. And if you're building a whole system, you're going to need peripherals, a keyboard and mouse at least, as well as a monitor. I'll include some additional links in the description for some recommended options for that. And you want to budget probably a couple $100 more if you don't have those available already. When I describe the core components of a gaming PC for a new builder, I like to start with a 7-part list. You could maybe say it's an 8-part list if you separate the CPU and the CPU's cooler, but I'm gonna run down each of those for you now, and we're actually gonna save the GPU for last. So number 1 is the CPU. For that, I'm recommending you build on the AM5 platform right now, which means you're gonna get an AMD processor. That platform is where you'll find the best chips for gaming, as well as some decent entry-level, more budget-oriented options like the ones that I have here. There are 2 generations of CPUs currently available on AM5, the 7000 series and the 9000 series, and the 6 cores are going to be the 7600 or 7600 and the 7600X, which is this one right here. The X means that it ships in a thin box, which does not have a CPU cooler in it, so you will need to buy a CPU cooler separately, but the X CPUs also run at a slightly higher frequency. If you go with a 7600 non-X, it comes in a slightly bigger box, and it will ship with a cooler for the CPU, which is known as a stock heatsink fan. So for budget builders right now, the 7600 is your best bet because it comes with that heatsink fan. If you want to spend a little bit more money for a little bit more speed, but also get a cooler that's going to run a bit quieter for you, then the 7600X is probably going to be your best bet. There's also the 9600 and 9600X, which will also be a little bit faster than the 7000 series processors, but these still don't have the best prices, so it's worth checking the 9600 and 9600X. But if you really want to upgrade from the 7600 or 7600X, I recommend one of the X3D processors like the 9800X3D, because that will be your best bet for gaming. Also, adding more cores is going to be good, not necessarily for gaming, but if you're going to do production workloads, video editing, or any sort of heavy lifting with your system. If you don't get a CPU that includes a cooler, you will need to add one on because your CPU does need a cooler. Fortunately, there are some really good air coolers available for around $35 to $40. We're going to be using the Thermalright Phantom Spirit 120 Evo today, which is going to give us a nice, cool, and quiet running experience. That leads us into item 2, which is our motherboard. I consider our first 3 items, the CPU, the motherboard, and the memory, to all be kind of tied together. The motherboard sits at the center of the system, and this is really what everything plugs into. So it will have a socket. We're going with socket AM5, and your socket needs to match your CPU. So if you're building on an Intel platform, for example, which I don't necessarily recommend right now because I just think that AMD has a better solution at the moment, but you'll also want to match up your CPU socket with the motherboard that you've chosen. For AM5, there are 2 series of chipsets, the 600 series and the 800 series. We're going with the last gen B650 chipset because you don't necessarily get a lot of extra performance by going with an 800 series chipset. You might get more connectivity by going with the X870E or even X670 or X670E, but if you're trying to keep your costs down and you're looking for an AM5 motherboard for $150 or less, then you'll probably want to go B650. Item number 3 is memory. This is system memory, also known as volatile memory, because it only stores data while the system is on. So yes, it is temporary, but it is also very fast. The standard for the current gen platform AM5 motherboards is DDR5. So We have a DDR5 memory kit here. The other specs you want to pay attention to are the capacity, of course. This is a 2 by 16 gig kit. 2 sticks means we can run in dual channel mode. 2 16 gig sticks gives us 32 gigabytes total, which is my recommendation for starting off with a gaming PC and should be all you need for now. And lastly, you want to check the speed. This is a DDR5 6000 speed kit, which is what I recommend. So go for DDR5 6000 and then see that last number, CL, cast latency. Make that number as low as possible. CL 32, 30, or 28 is a good number to shoot for. Items number 4, 5, and 6 are our case, power supply, and storage. Let's start off with item number 4, which is our case. A case provides a housing for your PC hardware. It provides some protection for it. It makes it so you can pick up the whole thing and move it somewhere else if you want to. You can actually get by without a case, but I don't necessarily recommend that because the other thing a case will often include is some fans to help direct air across your components and keep them cool, and that is an important part of a long-term PC health. The cool thing about cases is there's lots of really good ones available for around $60 to $100, some that even include some fans. And my go-to just recently has been the Fantex XT Pro because it's a standard size ATX case, which means it has broad compatibility. It has a plexi side panel so you can take a look at your build after it's put together. And if you get the slightly upgraded version, which is about $10 or $15 more, it comes with 4 fans as well. Item number 5 is a power supply, and as the name implies, it supplies power. So this is what's going to have a power plug that plugs into the wall, and then it will translate your rough and tumble AC power into much more streamlined and stable DC power at the right voltages to provide power to your motherboard and your graphics card and anything else that you might plug into it. In terms of specs for a power supply, other than going with a standard ATX power supply, if you're going with a standard ATX size case, the most important number is going to be the wattage, and usually that's listed pretty prominently. This is an 850 watt unit. To determine your wattage, I recommend to look at the video card you're getting or the video card you want to get and make sure that your power supply has enough wattage per the recommendation of that GPU. For most current GPUs, you can get by with 750 watts right now. If you're going with something slightly higher end like a RTX 5080, you'll want 850 watts. And if you're going with an RTX 5090, you want 1000 watts minimum. Fortunately for our needs, 750 watts would be just fine to get us by with a 9070 XT. Also note that this is listing ATX 3.1 and PCIe 5.1 compatibility. That means it has a 12V 2x6 connector. That is a smaller but very high power connector that's used for the latest generation of RTX 40 series and 50 series graphics cards from NVIDIA. That standard has been rife with complaints and has a higher failure rate than you would expect for something that's supposed to power GPUs that cost $2,000 or more. So if you are building an AMD system, the Radeon 9000 series cards and all of the older AMD cards do not have 12V 2x6 connectors with very few exceptions, so double check the GPU that you're buying. So if you're building an AMD Radeon system, you do not need to spend more money for power supplies that meet this standard. And in fact, that is a good way to find some good deals. Now, I have gone with a power supply that does meet that standard. We also have an 80+ gold rating for efficiency, which is a nice add-on for a power supply. I went with 850 watts instead of 750 because it was a $2 price difference when I ordered this last night, but that does mean that this system will be upgrade ready, which is nice. And one of the last cool features for a power supply is modularity, which means the plugs in the back of the power supply that route over and plug into your motherboard and everything else can be disconnected from the power supply side. That means you only plug in the cables that you need, and that can help reduce cable clutter. But again, that is not necessary for your PSU. So I'm going to link this one in the description, but I'll also put a couple other alternatives if you want to shave off $10, $20, or $30 from your build, especially if you're going with an AMD Radeon graphics card. Item number 6 is storage. Sometimes we talk about hard drives here, but honestly these days it's all about SSDs, and those come in 2 different varieties. For most builds right now, I recommend starting off with a single 2TB NVMe SSD. This one is a 1TB unit, but it does also have a Windows key on the back, which is why I chose it, because this build actually has a home that we have lined up for it. I'm going to tell you more about that in a second. The M.2 drives, which look kind of like a stick of gum, are cool because they're small. They can reach much higher speeds than SATA SSDs, but you are also limited to the number of M.2 slots on your motherboard, and most motherboards are going to have 2 or maybe 3 of those. So if you're looking for some additional storage, a 2.5-inch SSD like this one, which uses the SATA standard, is definitely a great way to add some storage onto your system, especially if you're planning on installing lots of games. Just note that these need to be plugged in separately. They have 2 plugs on the back. One is for the data that connects to the motherboard, and then the wider one here is for power, and that connects to the power supply. Now you could actually build this system with the 6 components I just listed for around $650 or so, and it would work because the AM5 CPUs actually have integrated graphics. So you can plug your monitor into the video out on the back of your motherboard's I/O, and you can get a functional system up and running. It just wouldn't be that great at gaming because integrated graphics aren't very good for 3D rasterization. So part number 7 is a video card or GPU, and the build you should be able to build right now, but you can't really. For around $1,250 would feature an RX 9070 XT. I'm going to be using the PowerColor Reaper version of that. Again, should be $600. I don't recommend spending more than that. Do not pay the current ridiculous prices, which are $150, $200 plus marked up. But the nice thing about GPUs is they pretty much all use a PCI Express x 16 connector, which pretty much any modern motherboard is going to have, so you don't really need to worry about compatibility there. You just need to make sure again that your power supply has enough wattage to power your graphics card, and you need to make sure that your graphics card fits in your case, which might have to do with the GPU's length, or it might have to do with the number of slots the GPU takes up or how thick it is. But thankfully PowerColor's Reaper is a standard 2-slot card. It's not very large, so this should fit in most standard ATX cases, including the Phanteks XD Pro. So those are the parts we're building with today, and this would also be my recommendation for anyone who's looking to build a really solid, middle-of-the-road, bang-for-the-buck PC, again, as soon as the GPU prices come down. But I also wanted to note that this system is going to have a home. We're building it for a specific purpose, and that is for Joe's good friend Laura, who he actually games with on a weekly basis. He records those sessions and he uploads those to his YouTube channel, so check that out if you are interested. But Laura has been gaming on a severely underpowered laptop, so this is going to be a huge upgrade for her. To begin, we're going to familiarize ourselves with our motherboard a little bit more because this is where most stuff is going to plug into. Right at the center here we have our AM5 socket. That's where our CPU installs. Around that we have mounting for the heatsink fan. The 4 slots over here are for our DDR5 memory. Most full-size motherboards are going to have 4 slots. Some will only have 2. So we're only going to be using 2 of these 4 slots today, but it does give us the option to install a 4-stick kit in the future. The lower part of the motherboard here is all about expansion. So here's where you have your PCI Express slots. Those are the longer ones here. The top one is reinforced with metal, and that's where your GPU is typically going to go. Further down we have more PCI Express expansion slots. These little short ones are by 1. This one is a by 4. This one is a full-length slot, but it's actually only wired up for by 4. Your motherboard manual or your spec sheet is absolutely going to be your friend in terms of determining how many expansion slots you have down here, as well as how they are wired up for connectivity, whether it's a by 16 slot with full bandwidth, or whether it's a by 1, by 4, or by 8 that's going to have a little bit less bandwidth, but still allow you to install something like a video capture card, for example. And then in between those slots on this board, we have M.2 slots, 1, 2, and actually a third up here that has a heatsink on it. So this is where we can install M.2 drives. They're held down by a single screw that goes down on that end. The little screws to secure that will be included with your motherboard accessories. That is one of the big differences from motherboard to motherboard, though, is how much expansion you have. The motherboard I have linked in the description is about $20 cheaper than this board, but it has 2 M.2 slots instead of 3. That motherboard does, however, have built-in Wi-Fi. That's one of the slightly more unique features of this board, is actually one more M.2 slot right here, but it's a short one. This is made so you could purchase a separate Wi-Fi card to add it on here, and you can even run the antenna from that back here to the motherboard I/O, so you can install mounting points for your antenna. It is nice to have a motherboard with built-in Wi-Fi support by default, but it's also really easy to add a USB Wi-Fi adapter to pretty much any motherboard that just plugs into one of your many USB slots on the back of the board. So if you get a motherboard that doesn't have Wi-Fi and you need it, don't worry, that's a quick and easy upgrade. And then along the edge of the motherboard, typically the bottom edge and the side edge, you will have a bunch more connection points for things like your front panel audio connectors for your case. These little guys are 3-pin RGB headers if you want to add some RGB bling to your system. You have little 4-pin connectors like this to connect fans to. You have USB headers to connect internal devices, or you can use these to enable USB ports on the front of your case. These are SATA ports, or serial ATA. You'll often have 4 or maybe 6 of these. There's actually a couple down here on the bottom edge, and then a couple side-facing ones right here. That's to provide a data connection for serial ATA, mechanical hard drives, and SSDs. Down here in the corner are front panel connectors that will connect your front panel power and reset button, as well as the LED. If you're lucky, your case will come with a block connector to plug that in, but sometimes you have to plug in individual leads. A A couple more connectors for the front panel of your case. This is USB 3.0, so it provides more bandwidth than the USB 2.0 headers. And then this one is a USB 3.2 Gen 2. This could lead over to a Type-C port on your case. And then we have power connections for the power supply, a main 24-pin connector over here. And then up here along the top edge, you'll have some supplemental power that's just for the CPU. These are 8-pin connectors. You usually have at least one of these, and sometimes you'll have two for motherboards that have a bit beefier power delivery. Here's a closer look at some additional fan headers along the top edge of the motherboard. These are 4-pin, and the two stacked right next to each other here are specifically labeled for the CPU, so that's where we're gonna plug in the fans for our CPU heatsink. And a lot of motherboards will give you an error message when you try to boot them up if you don't have a fan connected to cool your CPU. Finally, we have our I/O along the back. So this panel will fit through the back of your case and will give you connectivity externally. This motherboard has a fixed I/O shield. So that's this metal panel that goes around the outside that has labels and everything. Some motherboards, especially less expensive ones, do not have that prefixed, which means you need to find this panel in your accessories and install it into the back of your case before you drop in the motherboard. But here's also where you usually have a bunch of USB ports, often an Ethernet port for a hardwired connection to your router, as well as audio outs, and then this button over here, which allows you to update the motherboard's BIOS, or basic input-output system, without a CPU installed, which is very handy if you are having problems getting your system up and running. Oh, and I mentioned that most AM5 CPUs have integrated graphics, so if you're running without a discrete graphics card, there's an HDMI out so you can connect a monitor. We're gonna start off by installing our CPU, our heatsink fan, our memory, and our SSD to get our motherboard all set up before we install the motherboard into the case. So let's begin with the CPU. We pop open the clamshell. We're gonna hold the CPU by the sides and the edges. This metal piece on top is called a heat spreader, and that's gonna make contact with your heatsink fan in order to help dissipate heat that builds up on the CPU. On the bottom, we have contact pads. This is an LGA CPU, so there are pins on the motherboard and pads on the CPU, and you wanna make sure that you don't touch those pads because you don't wanna get oils on it or anything like that. Also note that there's a notch on the top of the CPU and the bottom of the CPU that will align with the socket, and also note that there is a little gold triangle on one corner. So those are going to be your hints to make sure you're aligning and installing this properly. If you look at our cover for our socket, we also have a corner with a triangle. I recommend leaving the socket cover on while you do this. We're going to take this lever here, push down to the side and release it up. That is pressurized, so you're going to relieve some tension as that raises. And then we can lift up our socket cover like so. Again, there's a bunch of pins on that side on the motherboard, and those are very delicate. So you want to be careful during this stage of the build process so you don't damage them. Again, holding the CPU by the side, making sure that that arrow is lined up with the arrow that's also stamped on the very corner of this tray, if you can see that. Or just reality check that those notches on the bottom and top are lining up, and we drop it straight down into the socket. I will often give it just a light jiggle to make sure it's settled down in there. And then we can close the cover. Our latch here should catch the other side of that, and as we close it, it should pop the cover off. Like that. And again, it'll take a bit of pressure to get that arm back under its hook. All right, our CPU is now installed. Next, we're gonna install our heatsink fan, and since we have a few different versions of this, I'm going to cover both of them. If you have a stock heatsink fan like this one, it will come with some thermal paste pre-applied to the bottom. This has been used, and I've cleaned the thermal paste off, but I'll show you a picture of one so you can get an idea of that. Don't touch the thermal paste, but note that it is convenient to have that pre-applied because it means you don't have to apply thermal paste to the CPU itself. AM5 and AM4 motherboards have these plastic retention mechanisms on either side of the socket. But funnily enough, a lot of heatsink fans actually don't use them, but some do. So you should get out the instruction manual for your heatsink fan, double check whether or not it uses these. For our purposes, for both this Wraith Stealth cooler and the Thermalright one we're installing, neither of them actually use these retention brackets, but they do use the metal plates that's on the back of the motherboard, which will sometimes come loose after you remove those 4 screws, but this one is secured, which is actually kind of helpful. So if you're installing a stock heatsink fan with pre-applied thermal paste, it's pretty simple. We're just gonna lower it straight down onto the socket, aligning the 4 screws with their 4 screw mounts. I'm gonna give each screw a couple turns just to get it threaded. And then once each screw is threaded, we would tighten them down a little bit on each side at a time. You don't want to tighten down one corner before you've started to tighten the other corners, simply because you don't want to put too much pressure on one corner of the CPU. And then once that was secured, we would take our plug for the fan, route it over here to the CPU fan header, and plug it in. You will note that these 4-pin plugs have 2 ridges, and those should align with the little notch that's on one side, so you can only plug it in one way. Of course, we're not using the stock heatsink fan, we're using this thermal right cooler, so you'll want to get out the manual for that to double check which components you will need for the installation. Turns out we need these 2 retention brackets. They're labeled AM4, but AM4 and AM5 CPU mounting is the same, so that's good. Then we got 4 little red standoffs here and 4 little screws. They've also included a splitter here for the fans, so we can plug both fans into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. Some motherboards have dual CPU fan headers, or you can use this if not. Then we also have a tube of thermal paste because aftermarket coolers often do not come with pre-applied thermal paste, but they do often come with a little sticker over the bottom that you'll want to remove to make sure that that surface doesn't have anything in between it. So we just got 2 brackets, one for each side with a couple screws. And then that gives us 2 mounting points with these screws sticking up, and these are pre-installed onto the heatsink. So we're gonna add thermal paste in a moment, but then it's just gonna drop down on top like so. The idea for thermal paste application is you want a very thin layer of paste between the CPU's heat spreader and the contact plate for the heatsink fan. There are different schools of thought on how to do this. One is just to put a blob on the center of the CPU, maybe a little bit smaller than the size of a pea. And we could just drop our heatsink straight onto that, and that would spread out enough to functionally work just fine. I have a slightly different approach, and I use a piece of plastic for that. You could use a plastic bag, a plastic wrap or something, wrap it around my finger, get it nice and tight, and then I do a bit of manual spreading of the paste. Depending on the kind of paste you're working with, because some paste can be pretty thick, this may or may not be an effective method for you. But we're just starting from the center and spreading to the outside. And again, we don't need complete coverage because the heat spreader sits above the CPU die or dies. There's actually 2 or possibly 3 depending on the CPU that you're using. So as long as you have it spread out reasonably well, the heat and the pressure of the heatsink on top of it will do the rest of the spreading for you after you get the system up and running. That looks good to me, so let's mount our heatsink. Just making sure again that we don't have any plastic there. We'll drop this down onto the CPU, line up our screws. And just like I mentioned with the stock heatsink fan, you don't want to tighten down one side before the other. So get both of them threaded and then do a couple turns on each side until it's all the way tight. One thing I should have mentioned before installing the heatsink is that it's a good idea to double check your RAM and clearance before you install this, because it can be a little bit easier to install the memory first. Thankfully with this setup, we do still have enough space to install our memory even with this installed, but once I put another fan on top of this, the memory is definitely going to be blocked. So here's how to install DDR5 memory. Look at the bottom of the memory, you'll notice a little notch. It's not in the middle, it's a little bit off center. So that's the main thing you got to worry about. Most memory manufacturers will put the label on the side that faces inside, but that is not universal. And then most motherboards are going to have you install the memory to the 2nd and 4th slot for dual channel memory support. Those are the slots that are a little bit further away from the CPU socket. But again, that's not universal, so double check your motherboard's manual to determine which slots it wants you to install to first. We're going to take our memory stick, align the 2 sides with the notches so it drops straight down and rests. And then we're going to apply firm, even pressure until it snaps into place. It's pretty satisfying. This does take a little bit of pressure to get them to snap, but as long as you're pushing down evenly on both sides and you have that slot aligned, it should pop in no problem. And now our fans for our CPU heatsink fan. We have 2 of these. One is going to install in between the 2 towers like this. And then the other one actually can go on this side. That's where we're going to mount ours. But you could also mount it on this side for a pull configuration if you so desired. Because these fans have RGB built in, they actually have 2 leads coming off. Practically speaking, you only need to plug in this one, which is a standard 4-pin PWM connector for the fan's power. But RGB devices will also have a little plug like this coming off of it. There's 12 volt and 5 volt RGB headers. 5 volt has become much more prevalent. That is the 3-prong one. Just remember that they're not cross-compatible, so don't try to plug a 12 volt into a 5 volt header. But for these addressable RGB LEDs, which can change different colors and are not just all the same color, they'll often include this, which means you can daisy chain. So first off, for installation, to make things easier to plug in, I'm going to take our little splitter here and plug it into the header that's labeled CPU Fan 1. And that is labeled in small text on the motherboard, but if you want to double check, you can also reference the motherboard's manual. And then we have these small wire retention clips that actually hold the fan to the heatsink. These go on the 4 corners. They pop around like that, and then this side is going to clip onto a ridge on the heatsink. Here's where you should also double check your fan orientation. Fans pull air from one side and push it through the other side. Typically the side that the bracket's on is where the air will exhaust. Some fans have arrows on the side indicating the fan's rotation and the direction of the airflow, but this fan does not. So I guess you gotta trust me and the Thermalright instruction manual that we're doing this in the right way. So I got my 2 clips on either side. I'm going to rest this up against the heatsink. Note that I can't push it down all the way because it's actually conflicting with the memory down there at the bottom, but that's okay. It's only proud by a millimeter or 2. Clips go on the side and 1 fan is installed. 2 more clips on our second fan, which slides down in between, and we clip on the sides in the same way. And our heatsink fan, our CPU, and our memory are now all installed. Oh, except for this part. Our 2 4-pin plugs into our splitter. And if you do have RGB, now's a good time to plug it in before things get crowded in the case. We have a 3-pin addressable header right here. So we're just gonna line that with the plug to plug 1 in. It's always so easy. There we go. Then we can pop the cap off for our daisy chain to plug in the second one. And if you have another daisy chain sticking out, I recommend keeping the cap on that to prevent it from shorting. Lastly, we're going to install our M.2 NVMe SSD, but we have 3 slots on the motherboard. Are they all the same? Does it matter which slot we install it to? The answer there is yes. You'll want to install it to a slot that matches the speed and the bandwidth of the SSD that you're installing. The 990 Pro is a PCI Express Gen 4 drive, and it needs a by-4 connection. So if you remember, both our PCI Express slots and our M.2 slots use PCI Express lanes. If you remember, this top slot here is a by-16 connection, so it has 16 lanes. We want an M.2 slot with 4 lanes that is Gen 4 compatible, and we can reference our motherboard manual to figure that out. I like block diagrams because it shows how stuff's connected. We have the processor up here, we have the chipset here. There are some expansion slots that run through the chipset. We can actually see that our third M.2 slot here is a PCIe Gen 4 by 2, and it's going through the chipset, which is going to introduce a little bit of latency, so I would want to keep that slot open for a drive that's maybe a little bit slower, that's not going to be as mission critical as our operating system drive. Up here we can see that directly from the processor we have an M.2 1 and an M.2 2. The upper one is PCIe Gen 5 compatible and the lower one is Gen 4 compatible, and they're both a by 4 connection. Since we only need Gen 4 for this drive, I'm going to install it in the second slot. That will leave our upper slot open in case we ever do an upgrade and add a Gen 5 drive, which will make use of that connection and that bandwidth. Also, some of the PCI Express Gen 5 drives can get a little bit warmer, which is why there's a heatsink on this one up here. Fortunately, M.2 NVMe SSD installation is dead simple as long as you can locate that teeny tiny little screw that came in the accessories. The connector is keyed, so there's a little bit of a notch, and there's a notch on the slot as well. So we just install it like so, pop, and then we lower down the other side and install our little screw. You might need a tiny screwdriver for this part, and there are some motherboards that have automatic retention clips that don't use a screw down on this side, but that varies from motherboard to motherboard. At this point, I'm going to set up our power supply by plugging in the modular cables that we need. The modular cables that we need are, for the motherboard, our main 24-pin power connector, as well as 2 8-pin power connectors for our CPU. Note that the CPU 8-pin power block can sometimes split into 2, and there are some motherboards that only have a 4-pin connector for additional CPU power. Thankfully, our CPU plugs are labeled with CPU on the CPU side, and they also have PSU labeled on the other side. That's the end that you're supposed to plug into the power supply. Now, the reason I specifically call out the CPU 8-pin is because there's another 8-pin power that's called PCIe or PCI Express. This is the one that we're gonna plug into our video card. And while it's still an 8-pin block, PCI Express is usually 6 plus 2 versus 4 plus 4. And then the shape of the actual connectors there are also keyed, so it's very, very difficult to accidentally plug a CPU connector into a PCIe slot or vice versa. However, it is possible, so you should note that there are 2 different kinds of 8-pin plugs, and they should be labeled, and that's how to tell the difference between them. So we have 2 of those for our 2 8-pin CPU power connectors on the motherboard, and then because our graphics card wisely uses standard 8-pin PCI Express graphics power connectors instead of the less reliable 12V 2x6 connector, we're also going to need 2 of those for supplemental power for our graphics card. Note that these have 1 plug on the power supply side and then 2 daisy chain connectors on the other end. We could plug both of these into the graphics card and it would work probably just fine. But if I have the option to have a dedicated plug for each connector on the graphics card, I will definitely go with that. So I'm going to be using both of these cables, and we just won't use the extra daisy chain one. We'll hang that off and tie it up. So we'll just plug all these in on the power supply side. They have little snaps. You should plug each plug in all the way until they snap, makes a little clicky sound, like that. Then these connectors up here are for both the PCI Express and the CPU, since these are really just 12-volt wire connections. 2 for the CPU and 2 for PCI Express. For a lot of builds, those are the only connectors that we will need, but in our build we have a serial ATA SSD. So that longer connector on this drive does need to plug into the power supply to provide power. This is an L-shaped connector. The plug has an L shape to it as well. So it'll just plug in like so. We're probably going to unplug this and then plug it back in after we mount the SSD in the case. And while we're here, I might as well show you a serial ATA data cable. That's the other shorter connector there, also L-shaped. Serial ATA data cables like this will come with your motherboard. Sometimes they have a 90-degree connector on one end, which can be convenient depending on the orientation of your motherboard connectors or the SSD in your case. But again, just make sure you're lining up that L shape to connect that, and it will also often have a little clasp that snaps into place. The other end of this routes over to your motherboard and plugs into one of the serial ATA data headers on that, which again, we're going to unplug and replug after we install everything. So one last modular connector here on the power supply side for our serial ATA power. And then I also recommend checking your case's internals, because some cases have a fan controller or something of that nature that also needs supplemental power, which might have a serial ATA power plug like this, or a slightly older style Molex plug like this one. Fortunately, most power supplies will still ship with at least one cable that has this type of connector if you need it. I'm going to skip this next step for the sake of brevity in this video, but if you're building a new system for the first time using all new hardware, it's highly advisable to do an outside of the box test boot before you actually install everything to the case. That way, if you do happen to have any defective components, which is not common but can rarely happen, you'll catch it now versus doing all the installation first and then having to undo a bunch of your work. If you want a full walkthrough on that, check the link in the description and you can look at my previous tutorial, but basically it involves plugging in all the power connectors to the motherboard from the power supply. You could optionally install your GPU and route power to that as well and plug in a monitor to that, or you could just use the video out on your motherboard to connect up a monitor, and all you're really doing is doing an initial boot to make sure you get into the BIOS load screen, reality check that all the hardware is being recognized, and then you can power down and move on to the next step, installing everything into the case. Here's how I recommend unboxing a case. Open up the top, flip the whole thing upside down, pull these little handles out so they don't catch on the internal styrofoam, and then lift the box off. You're almost always going to get a static shock on this part. Oh, I said almost. Voila. There's a few reasons I chose this case. One is the price, because it is very aggressively priced, and I like the fact that there's a couple different versions, so if you want to go with your own fans that don't have a bunch of RGB, you can do that. It has a tempered glass side panel, which is held on by thumb screws. I do like thumb screws. Shirt's available at paulshardware.net, and it's got a very standard layout for an ATX case. So as I'm making a tutorial of this video, this should align with a lot of cases on the market in terms of where the motherboard sits at the back of the case. The power supply goes in the bottom and a little basement area down here. That gives you lots of room up here for the air to push back and flow through. It's wide enough to accommodate large, tall air coolers like we're using today. It has dust covers located throughout the case to help prevent it from filling with dust, and you can pop these off and clean them from time to time like we always do regularly. We also have some nice future-looking features that maybe could be good for upgrades or swapping to a different cooler. An all-in-one liquid cooler, for example, is not something that I always recommend because it adds a lot of expense and potential points of failure to a build, but they do cool better than air coolers. So if you're going for a high core count CPU like a 9950X3D, for example, you could still accommodate a 240 or even a 360 radiator at the top of this case. It even has cutouts at the back of the motherboard tray for compatibility with some of the newer motherboards that have the connectors on the back side of the motherboard instead of the front side. So a lot of broad compatibility for this case. And again, when you have that along with a pretty aggressive price, those are the kinds of PC parts that I really like to recommend to people. First thing you'll want to do is remove the side panels so we can access the interior. And down here at the bottom we have a box of accessories. Our case came with a pack of accessories. Some zip ties are very helpful for cable management in the future. And then we have screws. Note that most DIY PCs actually have two screw thread standards. There's the finer thread that's here on the right, and there is the rougher or coarser thread that's here on the left. The ones on the left, which look like they have more of a coarse thread, are UNC 632, which is an imperial standard, and the one on the right is M3, which is a metric standard. Most of the time M3 is used for stuff like mounting SSDs, whereas UNC 632 is more commonly used for mounting your power supply. But what we're concerned about right now is the standoffs that ship with the case. Our case has standoffs pre-installed. There are typically 9 for a standard ATX motherboard, but it varies from case to case whether the standoffs use 632 or M3. The best way to verify this is to just check, and I have checked and I've verified that our standoffs in this case use M3. So to install our motherboard, first we double check that we have 9 standoffs installed. It's also helpful if these are screwed in pretty tight because you don't want them to unscrew if you ever need to unmount your motherboard. Sometimes you get a little hex nut in the accessories and you can use that to tighten any of these if they're loose. The next step would be to install your motherboard's I/O shield if it has one. If it's not pre-mounted like ours, this pops into this little rectangle at the back. You should flip it around so it aligns with your motherboard's I/O. Try to be careful because these cheaper all-metal ones can have sharp edges, and I usually recommend using the butt end of a screwdriver to pop it into place. Of course, our motherboard doesn't need this. So I'm just gonna pop it in by hand. We should be careful with our motherboard assembly, but do note that since the heatsink fan is mounted pretty securely, as long as we're careful, we can use that as sort of a gripping point. And then I'm just gonna lower the motherboard down very carefully, very slowly. Shift it over to align the I/O. And that little pop there was the motherboard sitting down and resting on a couple of these standoffs that they have, which have little ridges that pop up that sort of holds it in place. So the motherboard is now where it should be, and I can look and see that all my screw holes are aligned. And after that, we just install our 9 mounting screws. And for these, I recommend installing them snugly, but don't over tighten. All right, all screws are installed. Our motherboard is secure. Things are looking pretty good here, and we now have more parts installed into the case than are still remaining. The GPU, the power supply, and the SSD is all that we still need to install. For right now, I'm going to do 2 passes for cable management to plug in what's already installed here. Our fans have both power and RGB LED connectors. Our case has a bunch of cables right here that need to get plugged into the motherboard. After that, we'll install our power supply and storage SSD and get those plugged in, and then we'll finally do the GPU. So here on the right side of the case is our cable management area, and another reason I like this case is some of the cable management is already done for you. I've pulled all the wiring through to the back here so we can take a look at what needs to be connected. Every case fan you have installed in your system is going to have at least 1 wire coming off of it in order to provide power, and if your fan has RGB LEDs, it might have a second wire coming off of it to control those. Fan power plugs look like this. You'll typically see them in the 4-pin variety with PWM control. They also have 3-pin options, which are just voltage control, but either of those should be able to plug into a header on your motherboard. So make sure each one of these has a header to plug into on your motherboard, just like you saw me do with the CPU fan. Our 3 front fans have their RGB LEDs daisy chained together, and those lead to a 3-pin plug that I'll plug into a corresponding RGB LED header on the motherboard. With our fans plugged in, we can move on to the case front panel headers. The one on the right here is USB 3.0. The one on the left is for a USB Type-C port, and that is typically USB 3.2 Gen 2 compatible, which can go up to 10 gigabits per second. Then you might also have an 8-pin block labeled USB. That would be for an older USB 2.0 connection. Finally, we have a couple more 8-pin blocks, but note that these are keyed a little bit differently, and they're also labeled. HD audio on the right will enable the front panel mic and headphone port on this case, although I typically recommend plugging into the back port on the motherboard just because it's a little bit less noisy. And then on the left, we have a front panel header. This is for the power button, the reset button, and the LED. If you're lucky, it will come in a little block like this, and most motherboards are compatible, so you can just plug it right in one go. But if you're unlucky, you'll have individual pins that break out as shown in the manual. Those need to be plugged in individually, and you can reference the manual to see the chart for which goes where. And note that the LED plugs for this connector are the only ones that are sensitive to positive and negative. The power and reset button you can plug in either way. I took the RGB cable from our CPU heatsink fan through to the back. It has an open daisy chain connector at the end, so I'm just going to connect our 3 front panel fans up to that. And now we should have RGB LEDs. Alternatively, if you do not like RGB LEDs and you don't want them to light up, just don't plug this in. Note that there is a notch on one side of these plugs as you plug them in. Next we'll install our 2.5-inch SSD. There's a rack right here we could mount it to, but I'm actually going to use this cage down at the bottom since we don't have any 3.5-inch drives. It's just got a thumb screw holding it in place. This cage can hold 2 drives on top by mounting them from the bottom. One there, one there. I've already got my data cable connected, but before I drop this in, I'm going to connect up the power as well, just because it's a little bit easier out here. And that's dropped back into the basement. The other end of my serial ATA data cable needs to plug into the motherboard. Those plugs are actually right here along the edge of the board. And that makes good use of this 90-degree connector. Our power supply is going to fit in the other side of our basement down here, and note that we have a fan intake. We want to position that facing down because we have ventilation and a dust filter down there at the bottom. Some cases are different, so reality check and make sure you're not putting your fan up against a solid wall. But we're just going to shimmy in the power supply. And then we have 4 screws to screw in here. Note that a couple are at the corners and a couple are inset. Power supplies usually use UNC 632 screws, but when in doubt, just use the screws that came with your power supply. And for plugging in cables part 2 power supply edition, a reminder that we have a 24-pin main connector for the motherboard, 2 8-pin power connectors for the CPU that are in blocks of 4, and then 2 more 8-pin blocks that are 6+2s that will plug into the graphics card in just a moment. It can really help to reality check which side the clasp is on as you'll be bending the wires so that that'll line up as you push the wires through and bend them around to go into their plugs. And yes, these 8 pins up in the corner can be pretty tight. I fed my PCI Express power cables up through the basement, this little hole right here meant for those. And now we can install our graphics card, which is going to drop into this slot right here, this full-length PCI Express slot, which will match up with this edge connector on the GPU, which has a little cover on it. If this little latch is up, push it down to disengage it, and then you just want to eyeball where your graphics card is going to go, paying attention to the bracket covers at the back of the case, because we're going to need to remove 2 of those in order to make room for our video card's video outs. That's where you plug in the monitor. For this build, we'll remove the 2nd and 3rd panel cover. And you don't need these anymore, but I usually keep them with the case accessories. And then we'll drop in our video card. I've laid the case on its side so I can get a nice look straight down at the edge connector to make sure it's aligning with the slot on the motherboard. Also making sure I'm aligned here with the rear panel, and then we should be able to just put a little bit of pressure straight down. Oh, I'm also making sure this bracket's tucked in at the back. That's what was stopping me there. Then some pressure straight down. And it gives a nice satisfying snap, and the catch engages down there. And here's a pro tip while I've got you here. If you ever need to remove your graphics card, you will need to disengage that latch, and I recommend a chopstick for that. You can just catch the edge of it, push down. That should disengage it so you can lift the graphics card back out. To complete installation though, we just reattach our thumb screws. And finally, we plug in our 8-pin PCI Express graphics power connectors with the catch on top. It is at this point in the build process that you may do a bit of cable management, a time-honored process that involves grabbing some zip ties, finding some loose cables, grouping them up, and cinching them down. This is mainly for aesthetics, so in particular, if you're a new builder, I would say don't worry too much about getting everything pristine and pretty, but you do want to get everything at least tidy enough that you can put your side panel back on. And here's another tip for that, especially if you have lots of cables bulging out, lay your case on the side to put it on and let gravity assist you. And now we have a completed build. And again, per tradition, we haven't put the side panel back on yet because that would show too much hubris and undoubtedly our PC would fail to boot. But we do now get to slightly nervously plug in our AC power, make sure that power supply is switched on, and moment of truth, power button over here, and the system should do that. Lights, fans. It appears to be a functional working gaming PC that we've built today. Hooray! Now we can put the side panel back on and do this. So guys, that is how to build a gaming PC in 2025, and the only thing really holding us back is the price of the GPU. I have a monthly series following GPU pricing that I'll be continuing this month, so subscribe for that if you're not already. And if you just finished building this system or a system similar to it, your next steps will be to get Windows set up, do some BIOS settings, and I have another video on that I will link in the description that goes through all of those things step by step. But that's gonna wrap it up for this tutorial video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed it, and maybe consider sharing if you have any friends, family, or other people you're associated with who are interested in PC building, because it's really not that tough, especially if you have a guide. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one.